much, Louise, and thank you, Jenny, for that insight into the life and work of Juanita Nielsen. And it's such a great thing that her legacy lives on through this lecture every year. Thanks very much to Lee Rhiannon and the Greens for inviting me to give this year's address. Sorry.
Leave that.
Yes. It's certainly an honour to be in the company of the women who've given this address in the past. And lastly, but of course not least, thanks to all of you for coming out to listen to this on a cold winter's evening. Given the topic that I've chosen today, which is the threat to public protest, not only from the law, but from general public apathy, unfortunately. So it's nice to see a full house tonight. So on to the lecture itself. So it's a cliche, but when I was asked to give a topic, or this talk on a topic of my choosing, I felt like this subject chose me more than I chose it, because it's not something that I really write about all that much. In fact, I can think of only one op-ed that I've written exclusively on the topic of freedom of expression, and because of this, I was a little bit worried that I perhaps wouldn't do the topic justice. But as you know, all these other ideas circulated in my head about the issues I'm more comfortable speaking about, which is feminism and race issues and animal rights. This one just kept on coming back to me. It's just something that, you know, as I'm sure you're all aware, is a vital topic at the moment, because there are threats to our rights of freedom of expression and protesting on both state and federal levels. And I do have like a real and I think justified fear that our rights to dissent and protest are under very real threat. So to that effect, I'll start firstly with threats from the law, and I'll begin with our Attorney General George Brandis, who I'm sure you're all aware, tried to sell us on his proposal to repeal Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act, which is of course 18C, the provision that makes it unlawful to publish material that offends or insults a person or group on the grounds of race, colour, nationality or ethnic origin. Ironically, or perhaps even deliberately, even as Brandis was valiantly defending the rights of bigots, the rest of us were, and still are, finding our own rights under threat, as coalition and federal state governments continue to roll out laws that affect the less privileged amongst us. So what these laws all have in common is that they threaten not only our right to peaceful public protest, but even just to occupy public space. So I'm going to talk about just a few of these laws, otherwise we could be here all night. And I'll start with some proposed laws, not signed into law yet, but chances are they will be very shortly. And these affect a cause that's close to my heart, because as a vegan, and that is the Ag-Gag Laws, as they're colloquially known, and the disastrous effect they will have on animal rights advocacy in this country. So Ag-Gag are an American invention aimed at making it difficult or impossible for activists and protesters to uncover animal rights abuses in agricultural operations, or better known as factory farms. These laws have made it a crime to covertly film anything that goes on in a livestock operation, and I use the terms quote, I use the scare quotes around livestock, because that's not generally a way that I like to refer to animals. At least 7 US states have adopted these laws. The strictest being in Idaho, which deems it illegal to interfere with the operations of agricultural production. Now, it's important to note that this law applies not just specifically to protesters who covertly go to these farms to place undercover videos. It also applies to the workers on the farm. So if you're working in a factory farm, you see some of your fellow workers abusing an animal and you decide to film it as proof, you could actually be prosecuted. And indeed, prosecutors and workers who violate the law face up to a year in jail and fines up to $5,000, which ironically is the same punishment meted out to those convicted of animal abuse. So on paper, according to this law, filming or otherwise uncovering animal abuse is as big a crime as the abuse itself. And in fact, I'd actually go further and say that these laws treat those who protest animal cruelty as bigger criminals than the abusers. They capitalise on the defamatory accusation that animal activists are all dangerous eco-terrorists. The FBI even lists animal and environmental extremists, as they're called, the #1 domestic terrorism threat in the US. So this is despite the fact that no person has been killed or injured in any protest or undercover operation performed by such activists. So compare this to, for instance, the anti-abortion movement in the US, which verbally and physically threatens women and those who work in women's health clinics. Anti-abortion activists have murdered at least 8 people, and according to the National Abortion Federation, since 1977, anti-abortion activists have also attempted to murder a further 17, issued 383 death threats, committed 153 acts of assault or battery, and 3 kidnappings. So clearly not protesters of the peaceful kind, and yet it's animal advocates who are considered the biggest terrorism threat in the US domestically. So back to the Ag-Gag Laws. Despite widespread opposition and condemnation, they've spread to Europe, where Europol, like the FBI, lists animal activists as terrorists, saying that they use unauthorised protests and, quote, disinformation in order to discredit their targets and weaken their public acceptance. Images of sick and abused animals are embedded in video footage and made public, unquote. So what we're seeing is the act of protesting and documenting animal abuse that is being criminalised. So how can it be a bigger crime to film abuse than it is to commit it? And why are more and more governments across the world adopting such legislation? So I'll get to that in a moment. But firstly, here in Australia, New South Wales Liberal MP, Katrina Hodgkinson, the Minister for Primary Industries, set the stage for similar laws last year when she described animal activists as vandals and said they were akin to terrorists. She recently further clarified her comments by calling them agri-terrorists. Sure enough, it was revealed earlier this month that the federal and state governments, New South Wales government, were working together to introduce Ag-Gag laws here, with the instigator being none other than Hodgkinson herself. Her partner in crime, so to speak, is Agriculture Minister Barnaby Joyce, who is even threatening to strip organisations that conduct covert operations of their charitable status. So Joyce complains that animal rights charities have committed a crime, but still they have the hide to say, hey, donate here. So one significant problem with these laws, and there are many, but one is that they equate non-violent groups such as Animals Australia and Voiceless, which rely on securing undercover footage to actually inform the public of what's going on so that the public can make an informed decision. And they're equated in underground groups such as the Earth Liberation Front, which has been known to attack property, and the Animal Liberation Front, which frees animals from farms and laboratories. So it's completely different actions there, and yet they're all classed in the same group. So essentially US law, and increasingly our own, deems animal activists terrorists because they threaten the food supply, or so they say. But undercover footage has been instrumental in not only improving the conditions on farms for the animals, but also keeping the food safe or safer for people to eat. So as Voiceless, the animal advocacy group, says, virtually all we know about the incredible animal cruelty that occurs in factory farming has come from undercover video surveillance. And speaking of public safety, it was undercover video footage of sick cows that led to the largest recall in US food history when it was revealed that those same sick animals, many of them just couldn't even stand, were being fed to children through the school lunch program. So what concerns me most about these laws, apart from the catastrophic effect they will have on the animals themselves, is the eagerness the government is showing to demonise protesters in order to protect businesses. Animal activists are increasingly defined as extremists and terrorists, not because they're a threat to the public, which they're not, but because they challenge those businesses that put profit ahead of basic animal welfare. In a nutshell, it costs more money to treat an animal well, so there's no incentive to do so, financially speaking. To silence these protesters is to risk even more egregious acts of cruelty that will never come to light, not to mention breaches of health and safety regulations. Now, you may not be a vegan or animal activist or care much what happens to animals on factory farms, to which I'll say, why not? What's wrong with you? I joke, of course. But anyone who values the right to dissent and to protest criminal activity should be worried. Firstly, in the US, these Ag-Gag laws also apply to those filming animal abuse from public property, So you could be standing on a street and watching someone on slaughterhouse grounds kicking a cow, and if you film it on your iPhone and upload it to the internet, you could be the one that winds up being prosecuted. And this is indeed what happened to American woman Amy Meyer in Utah, who was standing on a street when she witnessed a cow, too sick to walk, being pushed by a bulldozer to the slaughterhouse. And this is why she was charged. And this is why we need to be concerned, because what we're seeing is a redefining of terrorism and criminality to single out anyone who protests against what big business is doing. It's becoming convenient and easy to equate protesters with terrorists just to demonise them in the eyes of the public. And now that it's been so successfully applied to animal activists, how long before that definition is redefined to include other types of protesters? Well, I'll say probably not long, given the crackdowns on other forms of protests across the country. First up, Victoria's new Summary Offences and Sentencing Amendment Law, better known as the Anti-Protest Law. This expands police move-on powers, and in a blow for anyone who thinks public protest is a vital form of dissent and expression, removes the exemption for political protests. So police can now issue move-on orders which are effective for 24 hours to protesters who are blocking access to buildings, obstructing people or traffic, or who are, quote, expected to turn violent. Now, I'm not sure what that means, expected to turn violent. In whose expectation? Who shoulders the burden of proof? This gives an extraordinary amount of power to police. Power that some police have abused in the past and continue to abuse. In move-on orders in WA, for instance, are used disproportionately against Indigenous Australians. So we have situations where in the Perth CBD or in Perth metropolitan area, they're given move-on orders from a certain area, which often includes where they live or where they work. So they're essentially, for the amount of time that the move-on directive is valid, confined to their home, or they could be risked arrest, which does happen. So back to Victoria, those found breaching the order are subject to arrest, and any who receive more than 3 move-on orders in a 6-month period risk a 12-month jail term. So this has led to claims that the laws are basically a thinly veiled attack on what remains of Victoria's trade unions, for whom public protest remains a key form of activism. The idea that you can't return to a protest is just basically telling you to a protest site. It's basically a way of silencing you. So even Victoria's Attorney General Robert Clark has conceded that the laws do limit an individual's right to move freely within Victoria, and may in certain circumstances limit the rights to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly and freedom of association. Of course, similar laws also exist in Queensland, whose move-on powers were expanded in 2006, and in some cases have seen people arrested without even committing a crime. So that state's controversial anti-association or anti-bikie laws banned 3 or more members of an outlawed motorcycle club from meeting in public for whatever reason at all. In January, 5 Victorian men were arrested as they went out for ice cream in Queensland. Now, the problem with these laws, the Queensland anti-association laws, is the same as with the Ag-Gag Laws. Although they target a specific group that may not, garner much sympathy with the general public, there's nothing to stop them being expanded to incriminate others. Gabrielle Buckley, president of the Liberal Democrats, warns that the Queensland's anti-association laws are so broadly written they could be used against any group of people. But both Victoria's anti-protest laws and Queensland's anti-association laws pale in comparison with new draft proposals in Tasmania. If passed into law, the new Workplaces Protection from Protesters Bill, so I'll just repeat that, Workplaces Protection from Protesters Bill, could see protesters face mandatory jail time and members of the public fined for inciting protests. Now, not inciting violence or inciting crime or, inciting hatred, but inciting protests. So this bill was triggered by recent forestry protests, which of course took place on the work sites there, but Tasmania's Resources Minister said it could be expanded to other production sites, other industries. So protesters here will risk penalties including $2,000 fines for invading or hindering a business. If the charge is heard in court and the defendant is found guilty, this rises to $5,000. All convictions will be automatically recorded. And in what will be Tasmania's first foray into mandatory sentencing, Second and later offences would carry a minimum 3 months and up to 2 years in jail. So, unsurprisingly, legal professionals are somewhat alarmed at the extent of these proposed laws, particularly the mandatory sentencing component. Law Society of Tasmania President Anthony Mahal said, quote, "It's a fundamental principle that our democracy is founded on, that the separation of Parliament and the courts be maintained. Courts should be free to impose penalties taking into account each situation." Also, not surprisingly, the Resources Minister, Paul Harris, disagrees. He says, quote, "This will send a clear message that Tasmanians have a right to earn a living, whether that be in forestry, mining or any other industry, without having extremist protesters come onto their workplaces." Once again, the use of the word extremists, also used to discredit animal activists. Simply protesting is increasingly being targeted by conservative politicians as counter to what reasonable or moderate people do, as if voicing dissent and discontent is in itself an irrational and radical position. What we are actually seeing is a concerted effort to demonise those who protest egregious behaviour from corporations. Instead of holding corporations liable for their actions, politicians are taking their side, whether they're right or wrong. And this is what we have to be clear about. Our current state and federal government is always going to take the side of big business. They will not take the side of the people. And they will seek to defame anyone as terrorists and vigilantes and vandals and extremists who publicly protest the activities of these big businesses, be they animal rights charities, trade unions, or just everyday concerned citizens. Protesting is becoming a crime. So, back to Attorney General Brandis, what's that he was saying about freedom of speech again? But of course, the dangerous laws are not the only thing hindering our right to protest. The negative rhetoric used against protesters and activists are also seeing increasingly judgmental attitudes from the public about what constitutes a legitimate protest or act of whistleblowing. When a small but noisy group of university students disrupted proceedings on Q&A in May, chanting slogans decrying the federal government's budget cuts to universities and the deregulation of fees, they were greeted largely with hostility. Although the protest only lasted a matter of minutes, the students were dismissed as rioters, even though there most certainly was not a riot. A clearly displeased host, Tony Jones, tried to shut them up, warning, "You're not doing yourselves any favours." And much of the live Twitter feed that made it onto the program, not the general Twitter feed, was unsympathetic, suggesting that this was not the right way to go about things. Afterwards, once the students had been safely escorted from the studio, Jones apologised to the audience and the panel, which included Education Minister Christopher Pyne, saying, quote, this is not what we want to happen on this program. That is not what democracy is all about, and most students should understand that, unquote. But hold on, since when is democracy not about protesting? Now, on that note, I will read an excerpt from writer Clementine Ford's response to the incident, which was published in ABC's The Drum. And I'll quote, "But of course, that's exactly what democracy is all about. Freedom of assembly, freedom of political protest, and freedom of speech. Democracy certainly isn't about the ritual celebration of a largely white, largely wealthy, certainly privileged political commentariat being given repeated space and attention to hawk its own agenda, while silencing the views of dissenting voices. I wasn't embarrassed on behalf of the students who fronted up to the live broadcast to unfurl their banners and chant against the deregulation of tertiary education. Rather, I was embarrassed to watch as a show, which purports to be a political weekly discussion, exercise such a conservative response to one of the citizenry's most meaningful forms of political engagement, the humble protest." So this idea that protests shouldn't be disruptive, that people should wait their turn politely. The catch being, of course, that some of us will never get our turn. That there is a right way and a wrong way to practice dissent, and the right way inevitably involves watering down our outrage, making our voice less audible and our presence less visible, which of course makes it all the easier to ignore us. This silly argument is indeed what the writers of all those bad laws I discussed rely on, the idea that protesters are disruptive and annoying and they should be curtailed. Since when did protesting have to be polite? And what good is a polite protest? If people aren't interrupted as they conduct their business, if they aren't affected as they go about their daily lives, if they're not aware of your voice and your presence and your dissent, then no one will even know a protest has occurred. which I fear is entirely the point. This is precisely how to make protests pointless. Water them down, regulate them, deny protesters access to spaces, both public and private. In short, do everything possible to let as few people as possible even know that people are protesting against something. Now, it may shock those who look down on protesters to realise this, but people, as you would know, generally don't protest just for the fun of it, or just to hear the sound of their own voice. They protest because they want other people to hear what they have to say. They want their discontent to be registered as widely as possible. Take that away, and what we have done is just made the right to protest one of the benchmarks of the free world and one of the things we like to lord over other countries as somehow proof of our superiority and our progress, completely ineffectual. And the more ineffectual protests are, the less time people will have for them. Which brings me to the third threat facing our right to protest, good old public apathy. About a year ago, I was attending a film screening out in Parramatta with some fellow feminist activists, one of whom is actually here today. As we walked towards the venue, seemingly out of nowhere, the streets filled with throngs of young people dressed in obviously what were sporting colours. I'm not sure what the occasion was or who the team was, but it was obviously very important to these young people because they're jumping about giddily, yelling at each other, chanting some sort of slogan. My colleagues and I looked at them wistfully and joked about how nice it would be if we could convince Australians to get just a fraction as excited about protecting our rights and the rights of others as they get about sports. So why don't Australians have time for activism and public protest? One of those feminist activists I just mentioned is an exile from Iran, and when she arrived here a few years ago, she was stunned at the lack of political engagement Australians seem to show. It's like this whole country is asleep, she said. So what is wrong? Why are we still sleeping? Are we so unaccustomed to wide-scale and ongoing protests that they don't even register as a legitimate option? Because even now, when virtually none of us will come through the Abbott government's first budget unscathed, I mean, apart from those key March in May protests, which did, attract many thousands of people across the capital cities, and of course, apart from those diligent student protests, which are still continuing, Australians seem to have given a collective shrug and gone back, to the gardening or to the TV or, whatever their activity they choose to pass the time. But compare, for example, the reaction to the plan to raise the retirement age to 70. So yes, there was initial outrage. Pensioners did let their displeasure be known, some of them directly to Abbott on TV and on the radio. But when the initial indignation faded, so have the public protestations. So compare this situation to France in 2010, when the then President Nicolas Sarkozy's plan to raise the retirement age to 62 from 60, which is still a full 8 years earlier than what will be our new retirement age, literally disrupted everyday life in France for weeks. More than 2 million people from all walks of life joined in the protests, in nationwide protests and strikes. And I'll just quote from the Guardian's report on that event. French protesters, furious over the government's proposals to change the pension system, flooded the boulevards of cities from Paris to Marseille today as Nicolas Sarkozy's embattled Labour minister presented the reform to a parliament echoing with jeers. Huge numbers of people, 1.1 million according to the government, 2.7 million according to the leading CGT union, turned out throughout France to demonstrate against plans to raise the retirement age from 60 to 62. There was significant disruption caused to trains, planes and public services as a result of the strike. In the capital alone, the CGT union estimated the number of protesters at 270,000. So let's just highlight one thing here. Significant disruption to trains, planes and public services. Disruption at workplaces. The very thing that our own politicians and sections of our own citizenry are telling us that protests should not cause. Ultimately, unfortunately, Sarkozy, much like our own government, broke an election promise and did push through that legislation. But regardless, millions of people turned out to protest. And in Australia, where we'll be forced to work an extra 8 years, so at the retirement age of 70, despite the widespread discontent, protests are sufficiently demonised here that people just don't see taking to the streets as an option. There just isn't the same mobilisation. Have we simply become too comfortable in our middle class existence? Have we, for the most part, had it, if not easy, but just easy enough not to have to take to the streets? Is it that we don't really think the government will let things get too bad for us, because we are, after all, the land of the fair go? So it'll be interesting to see just what happens when the budget comes into full effect, if that will lull us out of this misplaced sense of security. The outgoing Labor MP, Mark Bishop, thinks so. He told his Labor colleagues to allow the budget to pass, to let Australians suffer its harsh consequences, because only then, when they see how bad it can really get, will they be compelled to act. So of course the problem with this view is that it might help Labor win the next election, but it's not going to help the people who will suffer under the budget. So, what can be done? Well, the news is not all bleak. Public outcry and opposition to these new laws and proposed laws is needed. Public outcry does work. Not always, but sometimes. In the case of that Utah woman, Amy Meyer, who, as I mentioned earlier, was arrested and charged under the Ag-Gag Laws for filming into a slaughterhouse from the street where she stood, there was a significant public outcry that the charges were actually dropped. So we may turn up our noses at online petitions and the like and slacktivism, but sometimes they work, and it certainly worked for her. We can take back our right to protest. Let's not accept this idea that protest should not interrupt people going about their business. And I certainly balk at this ridiculous notion that they should not disrupt the right to work. If nothing else today, I would just dearly love to dispel this underhanded idea that working is some sort of sacrosanct right, when in fact it's been twisted by business and employer advocates to promote their own interests. For example, in the United States, the anti-minimum wage movement dresses up their legislation that keeps low-wage workers living firmly below the poverty line in language pretending to advocate for these workers. This includes such doozies as the Right to Work Act, as if low-skilled workers are just dying to work for next to nothing. So let's be honest, when coalition politicians and big business advocates wax lyrical about people's right to work, they really mean their right to make sure others are working for them. We need to reject the myth that public protests are outdated. It's a vital and necessary way not only to make our voices heard, but to support each other, to know that when we march and when we rally and we protest, when we call out our tacky slogans, that we are not alone. It's a show of unity and it's a show of togetherness. And on that note, I remember clearly the biggest protest I've been a part of was the protest against the impending Iraq War in 2003. I was at the one in Melbourne, which had well over 100,000 people. And I clearly remember looking around at all these people and gaining some sort of comfort. Not necessarily that the protest would be heated and war averted, which of course it wasn't, but comfort knowing I wasn't alone, and that so many fellow Australians were as dismayed and outraged at the prospect of another war. And that leads me to the last point. We really do need to believe in the power of protest, that it's something bigger than ourselves. Regardless of whether protests are successful or not, it's the act of protesting itself, of making our voices heard and our bodies seen, that's empowering and vital. So on that note, I'll finish with the words of the social activist Thomas Merton, written during the height of the anti-Vietnam War protest movement in the US. Do not depend on the hope of results. As you get used to this idea, you start more and more to concentrate not on the results, but on the value, the rightness, the truth of the work itself. And there too, a great deal has to be gone through, as gradually you struggle less and less for an idea, and more for specific people. The range tends to narrow down, but it gets much more real. In the end, it is the reality of personal relationships that saves everything. Thank you.